Ladies and gentlemen, a celebration of India's 75th year of independence includes a celebration of India's cultural, intellectual, and moral contributions to world civilizations. Substantial contributions made by India to world civilizations and Islamic civilization in particular has not received the attention that it deserves. As a corrective to the prevailing narrative, we have here today Professor Osman Baka, who will enlighten us on the role that India has played in the enrichment of Islamic civilization. Professor Emeritus Osman Baka is a renowned scholar who is attached to the International Institute of Islamic Thought and Civilization, ISTEC. Based in Kuala Lumpur, ISTEC is dedicated to the study of Islamic thought and civilization at the national and global levels, with the objective of promoting the renewal of Islam and human civilization through comparative cultural and civilizational studies. Dr. Osman has written profusely on various aspects of Islamic thought and civilization, particularly in the area of Islamic science and philosophy, in which he is a leading authority. He is also recognized globally as one of the 500 most influential Muslims in the world since 2009. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, good day and peace be to you all. Let me begin by thanking the organizer of this event for inviting me to share my thoughts with you all on the subject of Islam and Indian civilization historical highlights. The 8th and 9th centuries of the Common Era may be identified with the formative period of Islamic civilization. Beginning in the 8th century, Islam encountered the rich treasures of the world's major civilization. The greatest and the richest of these civilizations were Indian, Chinese, and Persian civilizations in the East, and Greek and Roman civilizations in the West. The treasures encountered were mainly in the arts and sciences, literature, technology, and institutions. The main purpose of my presentation is to highlight the historical fact that classical Indian civilization played a significant role in the early civilizational growth of Islam during those 2 centuries, particularly in the field of philosophical scientific knowledge. The Indian role was actually far more extensive than what many people thought and realized. Quite clearly, the Indian contribution helped pave the way for Islam's grand knowledge synthesis, or its golden age in the 10th and 11th centuries that impacted the whole world. Unfortunately, in the Western-centric narrative of history of science, the role of classical Indian science in the early development of Islamic civilization was downplayed, with disproportionate prominence being given to the role of Greek science. As a result, many Easterners today, Hindus and Muslims included, are unaware of the real extent of the classical Indian role in question. A very important facet of this early civilizational growth of Islam was knowledge transfer from the advanced cultures of the time, of which India was a good example. Another notable facet is knowledge organization that Muslims consciously pursued in the light of the distinct worldview of the new religion and civilization. I will now explain what I mean exactly by the term knowledge transfer and the term knowledge organization that I'm using in this presentation of mine. I will also explain the classical Indian connection to the knowledge activities that were going on then in the young Islamic civilization. Knowledge transfer to early Islamic societies from diverse civilizations took several forms and involved different kinds of activities. First, in the form of collection of writings that were found scattered over the territories that Islam had acquired in the course of its expansion, and their preservation in libraries that its followers had built. Second, which is even more important than the activity of collection and preservation, was in the form of translation into Arabic of selected writings from the inherited collections to which I have referred, as well as of writings that the Caliph of the day had received as foreign literary gifts. A good example of such instances was when the Caliph Al-Mansur, who ruled in the third quarter of the 8th century, ordered the translation into Arabic of a 7th century astronomical work in Sanskrit that he had received from an Indian scientific delegation visiting his newly built Abbasid capital city Baghdad in the year 771. The astronomical work in question was known as Siddhanta of Brahmagupta. Brahmagupta was a contemporary of the Prophet Muhammad, peace upon him. Speaking of the new city of Baghdad itself, it is worth mentioning here that several Indian astronomers were known to have been consulted in its foundation in the year 756. In the context of the time, we are talking here about 8th century India and Iraq. The work may be viewed by its readers then as quite a recent publication, which therefore possesses its own scientific significance. Brahmagupta and Al-Mansur were separated in time by a mere century. The translation was made by Muhammad al-Fazari, the official astronomer at Al-Mansur's court, and Yaqub ibn Tariq, under the supervision of an Indian astronomer. Ibn Tariq was well versed with Indian astronomy, and he knew Sanskrit, since he had studied under an Indian master. The Indian supervision of the translation was to ensure its accuracy and quality, as insisted by the Caliph himself. Another Siddhanta was presented to the Caliph Al-Mansur the following year by an Indian scientist by the name of Kanka. Kanka, who hailed from Ujjain, a city in the state of Madhya Pradesh, was invited by the Caliph to be his guest scientist. His expertise was in computation, or hisab in Arabic. The work he presented to the Caliph was titled Siddhanta of Aryabhata, which according to the noted contemporary Indian historian of mathematics, Professor Radha Sharan Gupta, dealt with the motions of the planets. From the scientific point of view, the work was indeed a highly significant one. On the subject of translation itself, I would argue that translation is the first real act of knowledge transfer. This is because translation involves understanding and interpretation of text to be translated, which usually help transform the mind of the translator. The transformation is none other than the transfer of knowledge from a foreign culture to the mind of the translator and to many other minds who are able to read the translation. This message of the numerous benefits to society that could accrue from the translation movement was not lost to the Caliph Al-Mansur. The mental and intellectual transformation in question would be even more significant when the translation is supervised by an authority in the subject, as was the case with the translation of Siddhanta of Brahmagupta. And the third, which is a more intensive act of knowledge transfer than translation of text, is interpretation study or interpretative study of the translated versions and commentaries on them. This level of knowledge activity led to the creation of study circles centered around translated texts. For example, the period stretching from the reign of Al-Mansur to that of Al-Ma'mun witnessed the popular use of the Arabic version of Siddhanta of Brahmagupta as a text for study circles among scholars and scientists in Baghdad. Historians of Islamic civilization generally regard the 8th and the 9th centuries as the grand epoch of its translation movement, when many great works were translated into Arabic from several languages, including Sanskrit, which we all know is the sacred language of Hinduism, as well as the literary language of classical Indian civilization. This translation movement in Islam was officially inaugurated by Al-Mansur himself when he established the School of Translation or Circle of Translators at his court, which he patronized. To be sure, translation activities by individuals have been going on in Islamic societies for quite some time prior to the state patronization initiated by Al-Mansur, but those activities were isolated and disorganized. The organized kind and scope of translation activities that we saw during Al-Mansur's reign could have happened only with state encouragement and support of the state treasury. Moreover, the high-profile level of participation of Indian scholar scientists in the translation activities provided clear proof of an organized state patronization. Apparently, this state patronization generated a new phenomena, or rather a new momentum in the translation movement that impacted the thinking of Al-Mansur's successors, especially Harun al-Rashid and Al-Ma'mun. Al-Ma'mun, a lover of Greek wisdom, founded a public education and research institute which was named Baitul Hikmah, an Arabic term meaning the house of wisdom. In modern terms, we may describe it as a higher educational institution or a research university with a concentration on philosophy and the natural and mathematical sciences. It was a gathering place for many scholars and scientists from many places, including India. In particular, it brought together competent translators. Although under Al-Ma'mun's patronization, the focus of translation moved away from Sanskrit to Greek philosophical and scientific works, knowledge transfer from Indian civilization did not stop with the end of translations of Sanskrit words. Indian scholars and scientists were also needed in the post-translation phase of knowledge transfer, when scientific circles emerged to critically study the Arabic versions of the original Sanskrit text. This phase may be described as the serious attempt by Muslim scholars to read and understand the Indian scientific mind. The actual physical presence of Indian scholar scientists in some of those scientific study circles, who were in fact state guests, spoke well about the authenticity of the Muslim understanding of classical Indian minds and their works. This observation may help explain why, even after the job of translation of important Sanskrit texts had been done, the House of Wisdom still entertained the presence of Indian scholar scientists as its guests. Having discussed knowledge transfer as an important facet of 8th and 9th century Islamic civilization, let me now talk about the activity of knowledge organization. What I mean by knowledge organization refers to the intellectual attempt to categorize and classify knowledge and the sciences, as well as to formulate concepts, principles, and theories in each branch of knowledge, and systematize them into an organized body of knowledge. The general aim of knowledge organization is to provide the necessary epistemological infrastructure for the next creative phase, which is the phase of research that will lead to the creation of new knowledge. In the early civilizational development of Islam, particularly the development of its knowledge culture, it was the House of Wisdom that pioneered the institutional role of knowledge organization in the sense I have just described. What I would like to assert here is that, as the term itself suggests, Siddhanta conveys the idea of a body of doctrines and principles, particularly as applied to scientific knowledge. In the initial phase of knowledge organization in 9th century Islam, the Siddhantas serve as the model of knowledge organization, at least in such branches of knowledge as astronomy, mathematical, and the physical sciences. It is only later on that the Muslim scientific mind turned to the Greek sources. Subsequently, however, when Greek philosophical and scientific works were made available in their Arabic translations for the first time by the House of Wisdom itself, Muslim philosophers-scientists apparently encountered a new knowledge or epistemological problem. In front of them were now Indian and Greek works in the Arabic version. Adopting different philosophical and scientific concepts and also methodological approaches, these Indian and Greek works, without doubt, raise epistemological problems to the Muslim mind. Reconciliation and harmonization of ideas from the two traditions that stood on opposite sides of the globe were called for. Muslim minds of the period managed to a great extent to accomplish that goal. The theoretical problems that were then encountered led eventually to synthesis of ideas, which to my mind crown the creative phases of knowledge transfer. As I see it, true knowledge transfer from different cultures would have to end up in some form of knowledge synthesis, which is usually viewed as creative in nature. But it is also to be noted that true knowledge transfer also carried within itself clear traces of the original sources of the ideas under transfer. In other words, you would not fail to acknowledge its original sources. To me, this acknowledgement of original sources is fundamental to knowledge ethics. Let me illustrate my point with an example. Al-Khwarizmi, who died in 863, the first outstanding Muslim mathematician, introduced the Indian numerals into the Muslim world. He was attached for some time to the House of Wisdom. According to some Muslim historians, he traveled to India to master the Indian sciences. The source of Al-Khwarizmi's Indian numerals was the Siddhanta of Brahmagupta. The Indian numerals refer to the 9 numerals and the 0 as a placeholder. In his book on arithmetic, he referred to numerals as Indian numerals and not as Arabic or Persian numerals. Following him, for hundreds of years, Muslims used the term Indian numerals, which was the right thing to do, since Indians were the original creators of those numbers. Much later, however, when Al-Khwarizmi's work on arithmetic came to be known to the West, he called them Arabic. In modern times, after the West came to know of the Indian origin of the numerals, he referred to them as Hindu-Arabic. If we read Muslim scientific works in various branches of knowledge in classical Islam, we will not fail to see their acknowledgement of the Indian origin of many of the scientific ideas that they had inherited. These references to Indian scientific ideas could be seen in Muslim works in medicine, astronomy, mathematics, cosmology, and physics. Usually, and certainly so, in the works of the creative Muslim philosopher-scientists, they first acknowledge the contributions of their predecessors from other civilizations before presenting their own original ideas in the field of study in question. What this kind of scholarly practice has meant to our common intellectual history is that the traditional treasury of Islamic thought has preserved the Indian philosophical and scientific heritage in its bosom for posterity to see. And through Islamic intellectual synthesis that lasted for centuries and that later became known to the West, the Indian dimension of the Islamic synthesis also became known to the West and indeed to the whole human civilization. Such had been the ways in which inter-civilizational and cross-civilizational encounters happen in history. Without classical Indian civilization, there would not have been Islamic civilization as we knew it. That in turn gave rise to the European Renaissance and subsequently to the modern world. The world needs to understand the classical Indian mind that had produced the philosophy mathematics, especially the numeral system and algebra, astronomy and medicine, that were the best in their times. They are permanent lessons that could be learned from the classical Indian mind. As for Islam, its main civilizational role was not just to preserve Indian science and then pass it on to the West without adding anything new to it. Inheriting Indian and Greek philosophical and scientific thoughts around that time, Islamic civilization came up with new synthesis that is shared back with both the East and the West. Let me now conclude my speech with the following remarks. From the perspective of world history of ideas, the interactions between scientific minds in Islam and in classical Indian civilization of the 8th and 9th centuries had proved to be the most fruitful. The civilizational impact of the interaction was especially visible in the fields of astronomy, mathematics, and medicine. The encounter between Islamic and Indian minds changed the history of science. Through its incorporation into Islamic civilization, the classical Indian scientific heritage found a new cultural home, only to be further advanced, and a sympathetic foreign acknowledgement that helped preserve the originality of the Indian scientific mind. What the world needs today is a more inclusive narrative of world history of ideas, a faithful account of the historic encounter of Islamic and Indian sciences could significantly contribute to such a narrative of history of ideas. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Emeritus Dr. Osman Baka, for the enlightening talk on the rich treasures of ancient knowledge that India has shared with the Islamic world in the first millennium of the Common Era. India today is poised to provide moral and intellectual leadership to the world, and the lecture by Professor Emeritus Dr. Osman Baka has set the right tone for the role that India is determined to play in the years ahead, in line with the spirit of these celebrations to mark 75 years of Indian independence. Thank you.